there's nothing secretive on there, I guess.
Well, we scroll down to this end.
All I know. Or, what do you know? Like, my inbox. Let me. There we go. Where I can go. Share.
There we go. Okay, now it should work. Awesome. And then can I take my laptop up there?
Yeah, can we try sending it again?
Oh, yeah. Did it not work?
I might have I don't know if I gave you the wrong thing. CARI.
BIN 21.
CARIBIN.
CAR.
CARI.
Oh, sorry.
Carry, and then bin BIN.
Okay, that must have been the issue. My apologies.
No worries. There I am.
Okay, hopefully it'll work. Fabulous. My mistake. And then that way I can, sweet. That way I can share the slides and then have the computer on my end so people can watch. Okay. Whew.
All right, guys. Thank you all for being here tonight. This is Gabriella Hoffman. She's
Hello.
our speaker for tonight. She is a columnist and writer and expert on a variety of topics, including environmental issues within the conservative movement. So that's what she'll be talking about tonight as we go into Earth Week. So everybody, give it up for Miss Gabriella Hoffman.
Hello.
Did I miss anything?
No, we're just
No,
starting.
take a seat.
Whoa. All right, let me try. Okay, we're gonna put my. I am also trying to simultaneously post this on the internet, so got that figured out. Thank you all for having me. Very nice to finish my spring speaking tour here in my backyard in Northern Virginia and come to George Mason. You guys have a great campus. I love coming. I've actually come here before for concerts, so I haven't really actually visited the campus except for your graduate campus until now, but I'm really excited to talk about conservation and how it relates to political conservatism, especially since you all run a center-right free market organization. I think this would really jive well with your organization and kind of fall in line with Earth Week. Really good timing, actually, for a speech like this. So thank you for having me. I won't bore you guys with my background so much, but as Caroline mentioned, I do a lot in politics and quite a bit in the environmental space and conservation space. I also am a board member of the Professional Outdoor Media Association, so I do a lot of outdoor writing. There's a lot of overlap with environmentalism and conservation, so I'll explain what that all means. And then I write regularly at Town Hall about these different issues and have a good time doing it. Obviously, interject a lot of new topics out there that I think a lot of people, libertarians and conservatives, don't see. A lot of issues that are starting to percolate. And then I talk about what's trending in response to what's happening in Washington, D.C., and much more. So I try to keep it very, I guess, diversified. And then I think I like to have, I guess, some experience in these different activities and issues because I do go fishing. I'm a gun owner, and I just started to pick up hunting a few years ago. So I try my best to be outdoors as much as possible. This semester, I haven't been outdoors as much since I'm traveling or I have some conflicts, but I do tend to go outdoors a lot here in the North Virginia area and in the outskirts. There's actually a lot to do in Virginia, fishing, hunting, and otherwise. We have great national parks, as you guys all know, not too far away. Shenandoah is close by. So I want to go into this lecture with kind of a takeaway of environmentalism in the current day. I think environmentalism is viewed as like a dirty word. I think when I've heard people use it, I've always had a negative reaction about it when I was younger. I often think of it like as a top-down kind of collectivist, big government type of term, very politically charged. And something I've noticed when I speak to audiences like yours is that people, especially in our demographic in the center right space, tend to receive the term conservation better. And I think it actually jives really well with political conservatism. So when I reference environmentalism, think of it as conservation, environmentalism, vice versa. So I want that to be in your frame of mind as something interchangeable. So I'm going to explain how you can marry the two ideas, political conservatism and true conservation environmentalism. I'm also going to explain what the left and kind of status quo environmentalists get wrong about conservation, what environmentalism currently looks like in this White House, in our political environment, and then how conservatives can win on environmentalism. Okay, I think it can be made that the two philosophies can coexist. But unfortunately, the environmental left accuses our side, including libertarians, conservatives, anyone who's kind of to the right of center of the political spectrum. They often accuse us of being despoilers of land. How many of you guys have heard any of these three accusations been wielded towards you? Anyone? Okay. It's a common refrain. I don't think it's as successful as it used to be in terms of the accusatory nature. It's not really passing muster anymore because we can prove them wrong with evidence we have and the different activities that we do. So in the beginning, before social media, they could get away with accusing us of being despoilers of land, haters of the environment, supporters of dirty air and dirty water. But I'm here to tell you those three things can be easily debunked and that they're not true. These categorizations of conservatives and people on the center right, when it comes to our perspectives on the environment, is not true. Common misconceptions we can easily debunk. Here I am with a deadhead. How many of you guys know what a deadhead is? It's like, think of like an exoskeleton of a wild game animal. So it's a deer. This is in Pennsylvania. And I wanted to show that I'm not only trying to target things for consumption if I'm hunting or fishing, I also like to do outdoor activities for leisure sake. So when I find like interesting treasures like this, like a deadhead, I like to take photos of it. Social media age, why not? But while there is no, I would say, exact root term between conservative and conservation, they're almost very similar. So you look at the terms and you kind of see the definitions of the two. And conservatives as a whole are disposed to preserving existing conditions, institutions, or restoring traditional ones and to limit change. It doesn't mean you're against modernity or progress. It just means you like certain things the way they are, kind of like wanting to maintain a healthy economy with a flourishing environment. Conservation, in the truest sense, because there's a lot of definitions of conservation, but I think the best definition is that conservation is the planned management of a resource to prevent exploitation, destruction, or neglect. And I'm going to explain more about conservation versus preservation, but you can kind of use the root words between the two terms and draw parallels between the two. I think that's what we can do. And it's in our nature. That's what I titled the slide to be. It's in our nature to be conservationists. Here's a Virginia elk. How many of you guys know that we have a flourishing Virginia elk herd? Anyone? No. This is in the southwestern corner of Virginia, and actually the first lottery application period to allow our residents and non-residents alike to hunt elk was completed. Winners will be announced at the end of May, but I was told, I think that $500,000, I think I got the email from our Department of Wildlife Resources that $500,000, I think, was so far raised from the lottery. So it's pretty cool to have that, but it was such a beautiful sight to see. This is a spike elk. This is a younger bull elk, male elk, if you guys don't know that. They have the horns, obviously, but we have some really cool wildlife here. And I'm here to show you, again, why it's in our nature to be conservationists. I think if you know people who are close to the land, who recreate outdoors, oftentimes they're going to be hunters, anglers, ranchers, farmers, and landowners. And there's also different categories of conservationists out there beyond what I've just listed here. But typically you'll find people who think like us politically, who tend to be recreationally outdoors or even commercially outdoors. I have met a lot of people in my media endeavors who fall into one of several categories listed here, and I even have met people who fall into multiple categories listed here. I know people who are farmers who are hunters and anglers, and vice versa, ranchers who are landowners and hunters and anglers. So there's a lot of overlap, but this is just a snapshot of who we can find amongst ourselves that tend to be conservationists. They're living it out. There is actually data available pointing to the fact that people who incline themselves to right-leaning politics tend to actually be the bulk of hunters and anglers in this country. Now, the data I've provided is a little outdated, but there hasn't been a comprehensive study like this from the National Wildlife Federation in about a decade. I tried to find some updated numbers, haven't found any yet. There's another poll, I think, from some other conservation group that showed it's more evenly divided. But according to the most recent numbers, it showed that anglers and hunters tend to be Republican and conservative, and they view conservation as equally important as gun rights. Really interesting factoid. According to their study, they found that 42% of those interviewed indicated they were Republican, 32% were independent, and 18% were Democrat. I think these numbers have changed a little bit because with the pandemic, we have seen a lot more people spanning political persuasions, starting to pick up hunting and fishing. It's not just exclusive to us, but people who think like us politically tend to incline themselves to these activities. And then of those who were polled in this survey, about 50% said they're very conservative, and 22% said they were very, very conservative. So it'll be interesting to see if such a study can be replicated at the 10-year mark. Maybe they will put out a similar survey. But if you read anything from like NPR or anyone else who has studied just kind of the political makeup of conservationists, oftentimes they say it's a more center-right predisposition politically. Even anecdotally, they'll mention that without referencing this survey, but they tend to view our audience in terms of conservationists and hunters and anglers as those who tend to vote Republican and often independent swing vote. What left gets wrong about conservation? So I talked about environmentalism, viewing it from a prism of conservation or true conservation. Here's a even more, I would say, comprehensive breakdown of what the different strains of environmentalism are. So we see an environmentalism advanced by this current administration that tends to look more like preservation versus true conservation. How many of you have heard the term preservation when it relates to the environment and how that's kind of a more comprehensive view over what like status quo environmentalism is? But if you don't know that, I'm here to educate you guys on why using that term for applying certain center-left positions on environmentalism is more accurate. Preservation, in my mind, is status quo environmentalism, and it often calls for top-down big government solutions. True conservation, which I think has to be made distinctly clear, is an emerging kind of view. We've had to kind of reclaim that descriptor. It's more limited government in nature, and it calls for private solutions versus top-down solutions, and even individuals tend to be more empowered under this framework of true conservation. Preservation by National Geographic, interestingly enough, is described as protecting the environment from harmful human activities. But it's also more defined by alarmism and anti-capitalist attitudes. This is something I've observed in my reporting. We often see this in media depictions of environmentalism, that the injection of capital and free markets makes the environment a lot worse. That's what we're seeing now being emanated in federal government. They often incline themselves to a selective exploration of energy. They often like clean alternatives like solar and wind, often are very reluctant about nuclear. They don't like fossil fuels a lot of the times, and they're kind of skeptical of domestic mining. They're okay with foreign mining of critical rare earth minerals, but they don't really want to see it happen here. Oftentimes, although some groups are starting to slightly move away from the demonization of individuals and private entities, but you see among the hardcore environmentalists, they do not like private interests coming in. They think government is the end-all be-all for all environmental problems or issue areas. And oftentimes, they are very, very keen on putting us into global non-binding treaties with unserious big polluters. Conservation protects the environment through responsible use of natural resources, or the wise use of natural resources. I think that's a pretty clear distinction, and you can kind of see that emanated in political discourse. You often hear from the left that any human impact on the environment is negative and terrible, and we shouldn't do anything, oftentimes. And then conservation says, yes, we have a place in environment issues, and we should be involved, and we can have positive changes on the environment, and it shouldn't be frowned upon to have an impact, to make things better. And oftentimes it's also described as stewardship. That's also another term that I like to refer to. And it's often defined by individuals, private interests leading efforts to conserve land, to protect waters, protect air, all that jazz. Also, it's defined by balanced use, multiple sustained yield management of public lands and even of private lands. There's also a big vested interest in promoting stakeholder cooperation, not giving into just a few select interests. So what we're seeing now take place in this administration is they're only giving a nod to certain interests. You don't often hear hunters and anglers are being included, except for a selective few who agree with their agenda. But you're not really hearing landowners that much. You're not really hearing from private companies. They feel very, very left out, especially with respect to oil and gas exploration, Endangered Species Act conservation, things of that sort. But it's private-public partnerships and private individuals and private entities coming together. That's ideally what should be happening under conservation for environmentalism to be fully realized. I found this really interesting article. I think it was from 2018, but I referenced the most recent data from the Fish and Wildlife Service that talked about the contributions of who the true conservationists. So I always make the argument, I like to make the argument that hunters and anglers are the true conservationists. They're not exclusively the only conservationists, but they are big players in conservation. And it's very true with respect to funding, with respect to conservation. So the Fish and Wildlife Service announced earlier this year that through the contributions of hunters and anglers through excise taxes collected on guns and ammunition, that $1.5 billion were generated to go back to the 50 states for habitat restoration efforts, wildlife conservation efforts, and hunter education. And that is primarily from taxes on guns and ammunition through the wildlife and sport fish restoration programs. So there is a established mechanism that encourages conservation to be wielded through hunters and anglers. And I'll explain the history as to why that is. While the Second Amendment has nothing to do with hunting, there is a slight connection, a very important connection. Guns and ammunition, as I just mentioned, the excise taxes collected do go back to helping the environment. Like I said, habitat restoration, wildlife conservation, and hunters education. And it is through this law called the Federal Aid and Restoration Act of 1937. This is one of the few good things FDR did, in my opinion. It's also known as the Pittman-Robertson Act. And it was passed after market game hunting kind of dominated the landscape and people were just wiping out wildlife with no accountability. Commonly hunted species that we see now here in Virginia, maybe your home state if you're not from Virginia, a lot of the wildlife we see was on the verge of going extinct. And then hunters and anglers recognized that, okay, if we want to have these species to enjoy, to pursue, we have to change our tactics. We can't just completely extirpate them from the environment.
Like they all did to the bison. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So there was a similar worry about commonly hunted species as well. So how are these funds distributed? So after you pay your license fee, and after collectively all of us do your license, your bow archery equipment, your tackle, all the different vested things that are under the purview of Pittman-Robertson, the Department of Interior takes those excise taxes and then they're going to allocate them to each state according to the contributions that came in. So it's through the Wildlife Restoration Fund and Sport Fish Restoration Fund through the umbrella agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service. And funds are apportioned to conservation programs in all 50 states based on land area and hunting and fishing licenses. An excise tax, I know among free market circles, people have a lot of questions about excise taxes because it taxes sinful activities like alcohol, tobacco. But I think an argument that can be made to say that this is a good excise tax. And actually from the Tax Foundation, I was able to kind of lay the case for why that is. So an excise tax, if you guys don't know, is a tax imposed on a specific good or activity. A 10% excise tax is levied on revolvers and pistols. And an 11% tax is levied on ammunition and rifles. And archery is taxed at 11%. And this Tax Foundation policy expert had talked about how $1 billion from state and wildlife, from state and fish wildlife agencies was selected to conservation and recreation projects. They were raised through what he calls a well-designed excise tax levied on firearms as well as hunting and fishing equipment. And the excise tax on firearms, was established under the National Firearms Act in 1937, although they didn't add archery items until 1972, and it explains the reason why excise taxes are collected. In terms of whether or not it infringes your right to own guns, I haven't seen an argument made about that. I know some people said, well, it will disincentivize me from buying guns. I've talked to a lot of people in the firearms industry who said there's no obstruction to your right to keep and bear arms. It doesn't affect your ability to purchase. And they welcome excise taxes, actually. And so what this gentleman also concluded was that this excise tax, unlike alcohol and tobacco excise taxes, it respects this benefit principle that is usually supposed to be established under excise taxes, that the tax typically enjoys general support among America's sporting and outdoor community. And they say it's actually a prime example of an excise tax used in the right manner. So if you want to learn more, the Tax Foundation has a great explainer on excise taxes, their morality, and the like. But there is a breakdown of the percentages that are levied on the individual tackle and sporting equipment. Where have conservatives advanced conservation in government? There are lots of examples, but I want to hone in on a few examples from the last century. The National Park Service, I think everyone, regardless of their political standing, likes the national parks. There's a lot of debate about national park designations and national monument designations. If you have an interest, I can bore you guys to death with national monuments. However, I think for the most part, people love the National Park Service. It's the least controversial agency. They have some issues. There's always a backlog issue. Sometimes funds are not spent properly. But Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican, not exactly a conservative at times, but he was very good in this area. He helped establish the National Park Service. The Environmental Protection Agency kind of triggers lukewarm feelings, or not exactly warm feelings, among Republicans. But under Republican administrations, it is not as weaponized as it is under Democratic administrations. But Nixon, a Republican, was the first to establish it. And even under the Trump administration, there were actually a lot of really interesting examples of true conservation at work. He was really keen on, his administration was wanting to show that you can reduce your emissions without belonging to the Paris Climate Accords. That was something that we were able to achieve. We were able to lower emissions without having to be part of this framework. Additionally, a lot of laws were passed under the most recent administration or throughout the last 50 some odd years. The Endangered Species Act was signed into law by Nixon, and actually the law is probably one of the best methods of conserving species that are on the verge of extinction. It has a 100% recovery rate, but it's not implemented properly. Very few species are delisted. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer it. But under the Trump administration, I was one of the few to kind of note that a lot of good conservation legislation went into effect. If you like to recreationally fish, especially like if you run a charter business, the Modern Fish Act was actually a really, really important piece of legislation to update recreational fishing standards in this country so it's not as regulated in the same fashion as commercial fishing. The Great American Outdoors Act, how many of you have heard of that bill, that law? Okay, a few people. That was actually one of the most consequential conservation bills in 50 years. It got bipartisan support. The former president doesn't get enough credit for that law, but he signed it into law. It was one of the best pieces of legislation signed in recent history. And then he also signed into law the Accelerating Veterans Recovery Outdoors Act, America's Conservation Enhancement Act, and actually there was the largest expansion of public lands for hunting and fishing, which is actually being challenged by a radical environmentalist group now. It opened up 2.3 million acres on various different national wildlife refuges. But a group called the Center for Biological Diversity is saying that hunters and anglers who use lead, tackle, and lead bullets are actually endangering species. So they found a way to try to stop the opening of federal lands to more hunting opportunities, although it's widely been accepted under Republican and Democratic administrations. But we did see the largest expansion of hunting and fishing under the last administration, but we may see that derailed, unfortunately. Here's a brief overview as to what we are starting to see take shape under this current administration. whether or not you're certain if it's preservation or conservation, I think you can make the argument that he is advancing a preservationist environmental kind of agenda, where few stakeholders are at the table, top-down approaches are more so welcomed. And I think it's actually very similar to Obama's 2 terms with respect to environmental policy, but I think he's even pushing the envelope a bit more. He has specifically sworn off having anyone from oil and gas in his administration. There was someone who is possibly going to be considered Department of Interior Secretary. He would have been the first Native American had Deb Haaland not been approved, but he was the second in command. He was the second most top official under Obama's administration, the top level official to be Native American. And he seemed to be a lot more reasonable than Deb Haaland. But he specifically said no one tied to oil and gas in the administration. So everyone who works in the administration usually shrugs off oil and gas or has been an anti-oil and gas advocate. We've seen the return of previous figures from the Obama administration. Gina McCarthy was EPA administrator, and she had some controversies under her tenure. Also, John Kerry is back as a climate advisor. Secretary Haaland, who is a historic pick, certainly, she was one of the original co-sponsors of the Green New Deal, and she's had some questionable positions on hunting, usually in opposition to it. And a lot of the people in other agencies similarly believe in like a climate-centric first agenda, preservationist policies. Obviously, the Keystone Pipeline cancellation was a very, very big concern. We've seen a lot of states sue the administration over a lot of these policies. And when I made this presentation, this was before we had high gas prices, interestingly enough, but it relates to the conversation today. But you started to see the Biden administration make concessions recently to say, okay, we're going to allow oil and gas development and exploration on federal public lands now. But it was a small concession, not a very big one. But we also see, interestingly enough, the problems that this administration is encountering is even amongst their own fellow travelers in the environmental space. We see certain interests in clean energy actually being pitted against species conservationists. I've seen different examples of people who want to support condors and eagles battling out against big wind. How many of you guys have seen that article recently that said that eagles, I think a wind company is paying like $50,000 for every eagle it kills. It was, I think, in the Washington Post, I forget where exactly, but big wind and big solar are often fighting with their fellow travelers in the environmental space. And you see this even among solar activists and tortoise advocates. So a lot of butting heads is occurring. And a problem that this administration will have if they want to advance a clean energy agenda is they're relying on adversaries like China for critical rare earth minerals that are needed to supposedly usher in a transition. So a lot of shortcomings with respect to their agenda. How this administration is pushing big government policies, preservationist in nature. Obviously, the first directive that banned new oil and gas leases on offshore and onshore areas, that had big ramifications. Like I said, they made slight concessions recently. And actually, if you don't allow, as currently made, if you don't allow offshore oil and gas exploration, you're actually cutting off the funding for a very interesting program called the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is funded by royalties from offshore oil and gas exploration. They may change it to offshore wind exploration in the future, but currently, this critical program, Land and Water Conservation Fund, which was permanently funded under the Great American Outdoors Act, this fund would go bye-bye if there was no oil and gas royalties offshore. They're also keen on rejoining the Paris Accords. I know that's something they did recently. Obviously, they are more energy dependent. We're reliant on foreign oil, which is bizarre. They want us to import Canadian oil, but they don't want us to build the pipelines to import Canadian oil into the United States. Very weird. Something I'm actually going to be discussing this week at another event in Nebraska, I'm going to talk about 3030. It's actually a really interesting concept. It sounds really good in nature, good on the surface, but I've had a lot of questions about 30 by 30 because of the lack of clarity with respect to how they define conservation and why is the government incentivizing people to conserve? Shouldn't people be voluntarily interested in doing that? So 3030 is something you guys ought to research a bit more. It's going to come out, I think, kind of in a more public view very, very soon. There's also the issue of expanding national monuments without considerations to the Antiquities Act and the limits set out by that in terms of presidential authority, and the same with wilderness areas. So sometimes legislation that is supposed to increase public access can actually, ironically, cut off public access. And I can explain what that dynamic is later if you're curious. How can conservatives win on environmentalism? I think a good way that we can win on energy and environment issues is to tie energy independence to national security. I know I'm talking about environment, and national security seems like a way off topic, but if you tie that in, I think you can have a lot of success in your group and in your writings or whatever advocacy you guys all do as that. And you can use the example of Russia invading Ukraine as a indication as to why this should be tied together. I think continually advocating for market-based and limited government solutions is the way to go. People really like hearing that. Even some on the left are starting to incline themselves to free market environmentalism because they're starting to lose trust with those who currently have power. I also think it's important that we decouple climate from issues. I actually saw something from a meteorologist, climatologist that I know, who's a pretty reasonable guy. He's kind of a oddball in his profession, but he was even posting a paper from people in climatology that said that it is time to start decoupling the issue. Not everything is about climate. Climate's important, but they're losing people when tying every issue to climate. When it comes to energy development, I think we could still advocate for an all of the above approach, but be lean on oil and gas, natural gas, and especially nuclear. Nuclear is starting to become a bipartisan policy. And then I think, obviously, to get people on board is to showcase how to personalize the issue or to personalize the high costs of these far left policies, what the costs of transitioning away from fossil fuels is. Do you want to lose your high level living standards? Do you want to lose that kind of first world comfort luxuries that we have here? That's often a way to convince, I think, people on the left of maybe reconsidering their position on transitioning away from fossil fuels. I like to cite two environmentalists who I think know how to do a lot of narrative building and have successfully shaped people's views on getting people to care about environmentalism. But someone that I was introduced to a few years ago, he wrote this great book called The Blue Mind, and it's about having a blue mind state of mind where anytime you're out on the water, you're at peace. You're not in this red state of mind. It's not political. Don't think like blue Democrat and red Republican. Has nothing to do with that. But he says that when you're in a red state of mind, again, not political, you're angry, you're more predisposed to being stressed. But when you're in a blue state of mind by the water, doing water activities, you're a lot more at ease, you're peaceful, things of that sort. But he wrote in his book how even his fellow environmentalists continue to cry wolf about environmental problems or the lack of, I would say, attention to certain issues. But he says that people will not respond positively when we bore them the heck out with a lot of facts. They won't respond with action when we make them feel guilty or bad about themselves. Yet that's exactly what the environmental movement is doing, scaring people, making them feel bad, and overloading them with data. This is a very fascinating admission from a very reputable marine biologist who is even calling out his own fellow environmentalists about their rhetoric and about their actions. So if you have an interest to read something and have source material to present to your classmates or to political opponents, have this citation from a respected environmentalist like this. I think this can help you. And how many of you are familiar with Michael Schellenberger? Okay, a few people. But Schellenberger is actually running for governor of California now as an independent, which I did not see coming. But he is a very fascinating guy. I've had the pleasure of interviewing him before. I'm going to answer questions in a little bit, sorry. But Michael Schellenberger is probably one of the more foremost people who's worked in climate activism, who's kind of renounced some of his past rhetoric and some of his past, I would say, writings. He has admitted that he's contributed to a lot of the malaise with respect to discourse on the environment. And he is someone that a lot of people in the center right are looking to kind of advance these different issues, maybe to address opponents. But he has a fascinating book called Apocalypse Never, and he has a great Substack newsletter. If you guys are curious, it's out there for free. He talks about this. And another person I should start including is Alex Epstein, who writes about fossil fuels and the moral case for them often. But those are two really good environmentalists who have started to call up people in their own profession and their own space as well. A final thought I want to leave you all before we go into Q&A is how conservatives or people on the center right, what steps they can take for defining the narrative. I think it's important that we don't package environmental talking points with a Republican bow, or like kind of alarmist environmental points with a Republican bow. Some people I know, I won't name names, they kind of do this. They say, okay, well, this top-down approach is actually really conservative, but when you dissect it, it's not really the case. And so if you need talking points about how to frame an argument or things of that sort, I could be a resource for you. Let me be a resource for you. I think it's not only enough to say certain things. I think being action-oriented is a way to be effective. There are lots of organizations out there spanning from bird organizations to hunting organizations to photography, everything under the sun that you can join and really have an impact locally. There's a lot of things here in Virginia, and I can put you guys to some source of material if you're interested. There are lots of free market environmental organizations that are great resources that can help you be armed with facts, and I'll talk about a few. And then I think telling your own story, if you have a personal connection to the environment or conservation, or you're very passionate about an issue, the best way to really get your political opponents or your counterparts to maybe give consideration to your views is to tell your own story if you have one. Telling people about my endeavors in the outdoors, people who disagree with my lifestyle, all that, don't like hunting, maybe they're skeptical of fishing. If I tell them about time spent in nature, how I like to leave it a better place than I found it, that I don't want every animal that I pursue to be hunted to extirpation, I think people have started to change their mind on different things. I can't convert everyone. No one can convert everyone that you talk to. But I think when people hear your story, and in my case, when I've told my story or kind of my view into things, that people have said, okay, I understand your perspective. And that fosters more dialogue. So telling your own story, leaning on pathos is a really good thing. And here's a great quote from Aldo Leopold about conservation boiling down to rewarding the private landowner who conserves the public interest. And if you are interested in going full throttle, we actually have, I think, our Dreesen fellow. Who's our Dreesen fellow here? Okay, Bailey, yes. So Bailey, he is a grad student here, correct?
No, I'm undergrad.
Oh, you're undergrad. Okay. For some reason, Adam told me you're a graduate. But Bailey has gone through the CFAC Dreesen Fellowship, and I work with CFAC as kind of their media embed. I do a lot of multimedia projects with them. I have a video series with the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow. And Bailey has been working in our fellowship program. It's a great program. You get compensated, you'll get to work under policy experts, and you can do it while studying. So if you have questions about it, he could be a good resource, and I can connect you to our colleagues. And then I also am a part of the Young Voices Contributor Program, where I write about these issues quite often. And if you want to really kind of get your media skill set to greater heights, I can help you get into the program if you're interested, and at least help recommend you if you're interested. It's really done wonders for me to polish my writing and really gotten me into really fascinating media outlets and TV soon, hopefully more so. But here's some great opportunities. I don't just want to talk to you about why conservation is conservative. I want to leave you guys with a call to action for you to get involved, and also to make some money if you're interested, or to get a leg up in the industry and politics. But I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm sorry. I sometimes rant a bit, but this is my contact information. Caroline and the group will have it. You guys can contact me. I'm very approachable, but I'm happy to answer any questions you all have. Yes, you had a question. I'm sorry. Yes.
Imagine if you one as governor, and second, since he's independent, which party does he lean towards? Democrats or Republicans? Because there's no true independent. You have to lean towards one party or the other.
Right, without so much weighing into partisan politics, because I try to keep things nonpartisan, since I do speak on behalf of several nonprofits. I think it'll be interesting to see, him being the environmentalist, what his campaign does. I think he's generated a lot of interest. He can run as someone who advocates for nuclear and for truly sustainable environmental solutions. He likes natural gas. He still believes that there's a place for fossil fuels. So it'll be interesting to see if he can campaign on a reasonable environmental agenda in the state of California. And he does lean more to the left, that's for sure. But I think from what I've heard from him privately, and then also from what he's talked about publicly, I think he says the left has kind of left him and he feels a little bit more comfortable in the middle. So he's kind of a wild card, but I think he may be able to capture the center right vote and people who are very interested about energy policy. So I hope that's an answer to your question. Anything else? Pick my brain, please. I want to answer any question you guys may have. Yes.
So when you use the word preservation and conservation, there's a difference. Could you go back to that slide?
Yeah, no problem.
Sorry, I just wanted to, I was questioning the definition of preservation because I don't really have much of a problem with that
Right.
term.
So this slide? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you agree with that definition? Right? Or because preservation to me would be, I mean, I guess to a certain extent that works, but maybe it would be walking on a path and you're not walking off the path because it's going to erode quicker. Is that preservation or is that?
I think certain things should be preserved, of course, but I think as a policy, preservation in the grand scheme of things is kind of taken to this outsized role where it admonishes our input. It wants to let nature kind of rewild itself. As a policy, it's like what I've been seeing kind of in the public policy space is, let's say, forest management. So we've had a lot of people, especially on the left, say we cannot manage forests because it's going to contribute to the problem further. However, if you don't manage forests, and which is what California is starting to recognize now, even people who previously said no touching a forest, we don't want to disturb it, whatever. They've noticed that the lack of forest management has actually contributed to intensity of fires. And I've written about this and I can point you to some articles, but a lot of experts have said that the lack of prescribed burns, the lack of clearing of forests has actually made some of the kind of tertiary and secondary and tertiary issues related to like watershed quality, species conservation, like leaving forests as they are without any management has actually resulted in more acres burning, more forests getting decimated. I think there was a scary statistic in Sequoia National Park and in that surrounding area that said that in the course of like 2 to 3 years, 20% of sequoia trees burned. Like they'll never come back. That's because of these preservationist policies. So I think as a policy, it calls for no touching because they want nature to restore itself without any human impact. Like I said, I think certain things should be preserved. Like I like a lot of national parks. I don't think everything should become a national park. There are certain public lands that they can make into national parks. But I think certain national parks are great. Like leave that alone. We don't need a Disneyland type atmosphere at the national parks. I don't think anyone wants that. We don't want to see kiosks in the Grand Canyon or Shenandoah National Park. So certain things you can leave preserved. And then there are a lot of wild spaces in this country. I think we often don't talk about how well we do with keeping things wild or keeping things like untouched to a lot of human activities. But a lot of people like to distort kind of the numbers of that. But I think as a policy, it is very destructive, like I said, with the case of forest management, because it says no touching, no touching. And then they don't recognize that they're overdeveloping in California and they're contributing in other ways to kind of the demise of the environment and also harming people in the process. A lot of people have died in these forest fires because of a lack of management. And so they're starting to say, well, what can we do to limit the instance of high intensity forest fires and not have a lot of casualties? So they're starting to say, okay, we're going to look to what the Eastern United States does when it comes to managing forests. They're looking to states like Florida, which actually has a really great prescribed burn program, prescribed burn regimen, and implementing that into their repertoire. So they had to wait, I think, to implement it, I think, until this year or next year, given concerns. But I think the left likes to say and conflate the two together. And does mean, like I said, you can't have any preservation, but they want preservation to be the mainstream view, which I think is impossible given just the size of the country and the fact that in many, many parts of the country, especially out west, people make a livelihood off of public lands. And that's kind of been a working model. It doesn't mean they're going to destroy public lands or have oil and gas everywhere or grazing everywhere, but it means that people can, especially if their property is against, let's say, Bureau of Land Management lands, Forest Service lands, or Fish and Wildlife Service lands, that there can be multiple uses, but it doesn't mean everything is going to be open to extractive activities. I think we will. I think there are a lot of people who want to kind of move away from this model of allowing for balanced use, but not every public land needs to have balanced use. And actually, according to the U.S. Geological Service, about 40.6% of federally protected lands do not have any human activity. So that's a good thing. We don't talk about that. But a lot of people say, well, we have to conserve more and more and more, but that has a disproportionate effect on public access at times, because when you designate things kind of in that manner, you don't have considerations for the public at times. But I think, like I said, certain things should not be developed. Like, I don't want to see a Walmart in every corner. I think that's okay to keep wild spaces. But when it comes to other areas, I don't know if we can have a preservationist energy policy where it says, like, you can't develop anywhere because look what's happening with the lack of oil and gas exploration here now. We're having to pay higher prices at the pump. We're relying on other countries. So I think it can be used in some instances, but it's not a end-all be-all, I would say things. So I think conservation is better. Yes, Bob?
What helped me, I'm from an NRA meeting one time, where I went to a gun show, and the guy asked me, are you a conservationist or an environmentalist? Well, I didn't know there was a difference. So I'm like, well, I don't know, what's the difference? I never forgot this. I said, a conservationist wants to save the environment or preserve the outdoors for people. Environmentalists want to save the outdoors from people.
Yeah, that's a good explanation.
And I was like, wow, I never forgot that. And then the way that works, what that looks like is, a conservationist approach is, okay, we have 500,000 acres of trees, we can get this many board feet. As a forestry service, we can harvest this many board feet of timber out of this 500,000 acres. Okay, Mr. Lumberjack, go get the wood. Well, the environmentalists, oh, no, that's cathedral forest. You can't be cutting the trees. Okay, well, what happens when you don't cut the trees? Sooner or later, God decides to send some lightning. Now that 500,000 acres is on fire, and it's got 30% more fire load than it should.
Yeah.
Then he doesn't get the board feet, and it all burns down.
Mm-hmm.
Then the next time it rains, you got a mudslide.
Yeah.
So then all that, you got millions of tons of dirt going in the river because it didn't stay in the forest because there weren't any trees.
Right.
Because once they had a fire, it burned like 40 you know what, and then you literally watch the forest go up in smoke, and this guy doesn't have a livelihood anymore, and she can't afford to buy a house because when I'm cutting down, there's nothing to harvest. I want to ask you, could you explain a little bit more about the 30 by 30 program?
Yeah.
I saw you refer to it.
Yeah.
Is that 30%
Of waters and lands by 2030.
2030?
Yeah. Uh-huh. So
the idea is to preserve 30% of the country by 2030.
yes,
So if we've got 15% preserved now, they want to double
right.
the amount of land in public ownership.
In a sense, yes. I'll explain as simply as possible because it's a convoluted subject because it's beautifully packaged. I will say if I wasn't a researcher, I would have easily believed it. And it sounds really great. And they say they're going to have the opinion of sportsmen and women and industry folks. And so the Biden administration claims that 12% of public lands and 23% of oceans are currently protected. But they want to have this 30% threshold for both public waters and public lands. For oceans, we're pretty close. I haven't seen any figures that have countered that 23% mark. I think we have a lot of waters protected, sometimes too protected, where it limits your ability to recreationally fish. And I started to see kind of a 30-30 prototype when I lived in California. There's a thing called the Marine Land Protection Act, MLPAs, which were established in the late 90s, which actually cut off a lot of recreational fishing access. They said under the guise that this is going to protect marine biodiversity because fishermen are so bad and they've taken more than they should, and these areas are very vulnerable. And what studies have shown with these protections in place is that it actually cut off public access. which then in turn disrupts the funding through through Dingell-Johnson Amendment Act kind of stipulations. And so I noticed a little bit of that in California, and I was like, okay, this is weird. I don't know if there's a national prototype. And then California tried to pass its own 30-30 before it became a federal initiative. And that was actually defeated under their Democratic supermajority because of just how vaguely defined and how far-reaching it was. And it would have done this, even gone beyond what they established under the Marine Land Protection Act, or the MLPA legislation in the 90s. So it would have cut off recreational fishing access. It would have eroded private property rights. So the federal approach says that they want to have local stakeholder input to protect 30% of waters and 30% of lands by 2030. I think the 23% oceans number, like I said, is accurate. But when I had seen alternatives to 30-30 come out from the Western Caucus, there's a Senate and Congressional Caucus relating to Western issues. So they put out an alternative. And I asked some of their communications experts, I said, where did you guys get your figures about what's actually protected right now? So their numbers, according to the Geological Service, it's a pad map US, and I can give you the specifics on this. But the alternative plan actually calculated that we already conserve and already federally protect to no multiple uses about 40.6% across BLM, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service lands. Far more than the 30% that they're talking about that they want to achieve. So it already exceeds the bounds of their goals. And it's a lot more, I would say, protected, almost 3 times over the 12% they're giving us. I think they got the 12% number from the Geological Service, but they accounted also private and public land. So it makes it sound like, oh my gosh, like we're doing a terrible job. So they misrepresented the data with respect to only to lumping in both private and public land, but not honing in on federal land that is already off limits to multiple uses. So it's 40.6% according to the Geological Service. So why are they misleading on that? They've also talked about how they want to incentivize conservationists and landowners. It's weird hearing the government say that they want to incentivize people, because anytime they incentivize people, it's usually subsidies or some other carve out, which is not truly voluntary or market-based. And on page 10 of the America the Beautiful plan, which talks about 30-30, they had said that they don't want to just stop at 30%. They want to go at least 30%. So it could be 50% of waters and land by 2050. And then they said they don't want it just to be federal lands or public lands. They say they want to encompass private land. So how will they do that if it's not necessarily incentivizing landowners? How are they going to incentivize landowners? Are they going to coerce them? How exactly will they incentivize them? Like, you have to get with the program because we established these guidelines. Like, is it coercive in nature? To me, it seems like it would be coercive in nature, not truly voluntary. Some people may voluntarily say, okay, I'll agree with these 30 by 30 terms and I'll put my land on a conservation easement in perpetuity. But not everyone else is going to say, yes, this is great. I agree with this. I'm fully trusting you with my land. And so on page 10 of their report, they say that they want to extend it to private land, but by what means? That's the question that is laid out. So it sounds really great on principle. They say they want to have hunters and anglers, that they respect their contributions, but a lot of people have questioned them, like, how do they define conservation? It's not really well defined in their plan. That's even something a lot of mainstream media outlets have said, that the conservation terms are very vaguely defined. And the fact that the government is leading such an effort also raises a lot of eyebrows, like, how are they going to incentivize people? The markets are better at incentivizing people to conserve, like what you know with PERC, how PERC talks about market solutions, voluntary incentives. So I don't know how the government can voluntarily incentivize you to conserve land. I think you should be able to, if you're a landowner, decide to add your land to a conservation easement or set aside more land for public waters and public lands, things of that sort. So very convoluted. So we're now going into kind of the first vestiges of it. And there will certainly be, I think, a debate playing out about that. Actually, 15 governors so far have signed on to Stop 30 by 30 initiatives. And I think more governors will join in because they're worried that the government will swoop in too much and take over what private individuals and businesses do best, tackling these conservation issues. So a lot of governors are very, very concerned that it's going to be a far-reaching plan, that they're going to kind of defeat the purpose of conservation and that it may be a more preservationist model. and complicate a lot of matters and institute a lot of top-down approaches. So that's kind of 30-30 in a nutshell. And I can offline, I'll send you more resources too, because
Are you talking about like Democrat governors as well, or just Republican?
just Republicans so far.
Right.
I wonder if there would be any Democrats who oppose it. Maybe, I can't think of anyone maybe North Carolina? I don't know. So far, no Democrats have come out against it, to my knowledge. We'll see if that changes anytime soon. But so far, it's just 15 Republican governors, actually being led by Governor Pete Ricketts of Nebraska. I'll be going to this event. If you want to follow along on my social media, I'll be exploring this event a bit more, and I'll write about kind of my purview into the event, because there's been some press so far about it, saying that these groups we're organizing a fringe and they're crazy and they're this, but it's actually a very well organized grassroots efforts of local people who are very much of the sound mind and who very much care about the land that they tend to. So I think you'll start to see a lot more people cover this issue in depth. And I think there should be a debate. We can debate on the merits of 30 by 30. I know, Bo, some of our friends in conservation may support 30-30. I try not to be, I would say, abrasive about my opposition. I have a lot of concerns, but I can hear the arguments in favor of it and give them, obviously, the latitude to discuss it. But I have a lot of concerns about it. So that's kind of where I come about from it. And that's kind of a snapshot of it. Yes?
So do you have any, like, talking points for people who are opposed to nuclear energy? Because I know, like, I've met a lot of people, not just like left-leaning people, but also like moderates and even right-leaning people
Really?
who are opposed to nuclear energy. Like, I know a lot of people are opposed because of like Chernobyl and stuff like that, but do you have any like talking points to tell them that it's like a genuine source of clean energy?
So certainly there is a fear because of Chernobyl. And my family fled the Soviet Union actually just before Chernobyl exploded, a few months before. So they would have been affected by that had they stayed there. The far-reaching effects of that explosion did have a lot of health impact on people in the Baltics and that region. But the problem with using or people leaning on the Chernobyl argument is the difference between the government that was in charge, what type of structure. It was a collectivist structure. So the Soviet Union was not free market in whatsoever. It was very much a top-down collectivist society. So you can point to the Chernobyl example and say, well, that's what happens when government decides to tackle that type of issue. But in the United States, we've had a similar incident called 3 Mile Island, but I think it wasn't as severe. It was a lot less damaging than Chernobyl was. But the United States, actually, you can even point to an example of many states in the country, including Virginia, actually power their electricity grid off of nuclear. There hasn't been any meltdown or any catastrophic events domestically with a lot of nuclear plants. So Virginia, I think we I think 29% of our electricity is generated from nuclear. And we haven't really had any severe incidences of nuclear reactor explosions. You can also talk about how the base load is really efficient when it's a free society like the United States, encouraging the development of nuclear energy. So when it comes to construction of the reactors and the plants, it actually can be done on a smaller scale compared to other clean energy alternatives. That's what I've heard people make the argument. There's also a 100% base load, so you don't need wind power or the sun to power nuclear. So it could run autonomously 24/7 without having some other source of energy to power it. It doesn't really need backup too. And construction-wise, I've heard that it requires a lot less land than a solar field or wind turbines do. And that the energies would be a lot cheaper if it were to be, I would say, innovated after a time. Like, it wouldn't add to your electricity bill like solar and wind do. And I think a lot of people can say that if you have a more market-based society doing it, you're going to see fewer disasters because we have better environmental standards in place in the United States versus the Soviet Union, which had no environmental standards in place. A lot of people like to say, well, a society like that was great towards the environment. I've heard numerous times from my dad that the water quality was a lot worse, the smog was terrible. Under the Soviet Union, a lot of lakes and ponds and rivers were polluted to oblivion. It was horrible, he told me. I showed a video of Delegate Nick Freitas. He actually, if you guys are curious, Delegate Nick Freitas made a really great video about a highly polluted lake in Russia. It's a 3-minute long video. If you go to his YouTube channel, he's a delegate here in Virginia, if you didn't know. Very popular guy, very savvy. And he deconstructed the differences between like a Soviet-run environmental system versus the United States. And he talked about how kind of top-down approaches lead to these disasters and erosion and ruining of different rivers and lakes. So I think you could the takeaway points you could say, well, compare the differences in government. Soviet was not free in terms of a free society. The United States, while it does have environmental regulations, it's a lot more freer, and there can be market innovations to speed up the production and development of nuclear energy. So it can be done safer, hopefully quicker, and with fewer roadblocks. You could also list the states that currently do have nuclear as part of their electricity grid. A lot of states do use Virginia as an example, and how there haven't really been any explosions. And then you could say that it's actually becoming more popular across party divides. Republicans and even Democrats now are saying it's time to embrace nuclear. So you can even show public opinion showing that more people are coming around to it because it's a lot more efficient. It doesn't require having a base load from somewhere else. And that in the grand scheme of things, it could be a lot cheaper to our electricity bills in the future. So I hope those are kind of a few takeaway points. But just do a Google search and you'll see a lot of different data you can use. But we can use the facts on our side to say, hey, nuclear is actually very viable and very safe.
There's an old movie called The China Syndrome with James Farmer. And that brought about an entire decade's worth of fever through my generation. And it was about 3 mile an hour, which she referenced, which is actually in Pennsylvania. And you can still see the nuclear reactors out sitting in the middle of the Susquehanna River. Not a single person died.
Right.
The biggest problem with nuclear is people are concerned about what to do with the spent fuel rods.
Mm-hmm.
But clearly it works because we have submarines and aircraft carriers that run off nuclear energy. They don't ever have to come. The only reason a nuclear sub comes in is to get more food. They don't need fuel. They run for petrol.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no CO2. There's no carbon.
Yeah.
Everybody's terrified of carbon emissions. Zero.
Yep.
carbon
Net zero,
emissions from
truly.
nuclear. Zero. And like she was saying, it doesn't matter. If you have a windmill, then generate energy when the wind is blowing. Some town doesn't collect the energy at the center of the China. That nuclear plant never closes. Doesn't matter whether it's raining or shining or snowing, it's 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
It's running. So go look at the China Syndrome and you'll find out why people are afraid of what we don't know. About 40% of France's energy comes from nuclear. And they're looking at more now because of what's
Yes.
going on in Russia. They're like, we don't want to buy any more oil from. It's not that they don't want to buy any more oil from the Russians, as much as they don't want to be controlled by a third party. I would much rather buy it from somebody in Houston than somebody in Saudi Arabia or Russia. But if the French have more nuclear power than any other country.
Any more questions or thoughts? I'm happy to answer any general questions you guys may have. Yes.
So up here, right? So what are the rules for hunting?
Hunting in Northern Virginia?
Yeah.
Okay, so first you have to pass your hunter's education course. Very easy to do. You pay like maybe $50 tops and you can do it online or in person. I've done it online because it was much easier, but I recommend obviously trying it in the field as well. But online, if you're very busy, is an easy method to do it. And then once you get your hunter's education course, you complete it, I definitely recommend finding a mentor before you go into the field. So someone's going to show you gun safety basics. They're also going to show you and educate you on the different laws, what type of species are around, what type of weapons you could use, whether it's rifle or bow archery or crossbow. But here in Northern Virginia, you'd be surprised. You could actually do a lot of hunting. Closer to the city, however, only archery is largely encouraged. So I live near Mount Vernon, or I live near Alexandria, because I don't want people to find or Google where I live. But I live close to where George Washington lives, and retired and died. And in my neighborhood, we strictly have an archery program. And that's much like most of Northern Virginia. And then the further you go out, you could do rifle and even bow hunting too. But according to your locality, there is some form of hunting allowed in most places here in Virginia, and even this close to the city. But closer to the city, you can do archery. But if you go to like Prince William County or Fauquier County, and even Loudoun, it's going to be a lot less strident. You would be able to hunt with a hunting rifle. Just depends on the locality. And then there are seasons. So seasons in Virginia may vary according to, let's say, muzzleloader, rifle, bow archery. Bow archery is actually the longest season in Virginia, from what I understand. But everything is according to season and species. You may only be able to use certain chambered rifles, or you may only be able to use bow archery. But the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources is a great resource. But yes, you can, in a nutshell, hunt in Virginia, and this close to the city. But it's a lot more limited because the urban density, unfortunately, complicates things. But you can, because we have a problem with all this deer. And deer, if you guys don't know, actually are harborers of the Lyme's disease tick. So as a control method, people want the deer population to be culled a bit more so they don't spread Lyme's disease. That's an argument that a lot of people make. And there's also a concern with chronic wasting disease. It's kind of like mad cow disease, but we haven't seen the transference yet from deer to humans. But there's a lot of kind of concerns like that about consuming deer that are infected with CWD. But I don't think we've had too many cases here. We've had some on the outskirts of like Winchester and kind of those counties. That's something people are also very concerned about if deer are not properly managed from there. But if you need resources, actually fishing is much easier and fewer barriers to entry. You can go urban trout fishing in a lot of places in Fairfax County, even the city of Alexandria. There's a Lake Cook. Buy a license first before you go because it's regulated. You don't want to poach. But you can trout fish very close to Alexandria and even portions of Fairfax County. And you can catch like brown trout, rainbow trout, and brook trout sometimes. And even tiger trout if you're closer to Richmond. So fishing you can do like close to your school. So you guys should definitely try to do that if you want to blow off some steam. But yes, you can hunt here too.
So what's like, I just want to go hunting around and just play around, you know.
Play around? What do you mean?
It's like play around with the animal.
Oh, to do shooting sports?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, just recreationally shooting. Oh, of course, there are plenty of ranges too. To not do the harvesting of animals, of course. Lorton, there's also some ranges here. There's also Bull Run Park. Have you guys heard of Bull Run Park? It's not too far away from here. And there's a lot of indoor ranges, but outdoor ranges, you have to go a little bit further. But plenty of indoor ranges here if you want to do some handgun shooting and even rifle shooting.
So I want to play around with tracers, but they don't allow it.
I don't know. I'm not the best person to ask on that.
Also, like, is there any restrictions on like what you can hunt? Like,
What you can't hunt?
yeah.
You cannot hunt foxes. Definitely not in Northern Virginia. But no birds of prey. Do not hit birds. We'd like to keep the bald eagles from going from extinction again. But you can hunt like turkey, deer, like I mentioned, elk in southwestern Virginia. If you enter to the lottery and you win a hunting license to go hunting for elk, you can do trapping of beaver and coyotes and other species, fur-bearing species. Oh gosh, duck. What else? Rabbits, squirrels, lots of different animals you can hunt. Uh-huh.
What about like dogs?
Dogs are coyote hunting. Predator management is allowed in Virginia, yeah. But you have to make sure you're in the right county to do it, because I don't think you can do it necessarily here. But predator management is allowed in Virginia, in most localities. Any more questions?
Whatever you find, you can eat it, right?
Yes, as long as it's not infected with like any like bear, and you can hunt bear here in Virginia too. I saw that there was some issue plaguing black bears here. I forget exactly some problem, but yeah, as long as they're not infected, you can largely eat what you hunt. Mm-hmm. You can actually make really cool recipes from a lot of game species.
What about like rules on trapping?
Trapping, look at the DWR website. So you have to go through a course to get certified, because you can't just trap. You have to get certification, and then they're going to teach you about trapping and what's allowed, and you can learn how to do trapping. Mm-hmm.
Well, I was thinking of doing it, I'll set up like a trap and like, animal goes on the trap, and then we shoot them.
I don't think you can do that. It's that the shooting part is usually not allowed. You have to humanely trap.
So am I allowed to shoot a person?
No, do not do that. Yes, Caroline.
I think I'll close
Yes.
with one more question, kind of going back to nuclear energy. We were
Sure.
talking about that. I was wondering what you knew about small modular reactors, and I guess, do you know what those are, just based on your facial expression?
I need to do
And-
more research
Okay,
before I can have an educated answer to that. I've heard of it in passing, but
okay.
I don't know too much. I've heard of thorium.
Mm-hmm.
Someone was explaining to me about thorium relating to nuclear. But there's a lot of capabilities, I think, in that niche. And I think we'll start to see more innovation on that front. But I don't know too much on that
Okay.
front, unfortunately. But, are we good on questions? Okay, one more question quickly. Yes,
Where did your parents come? Where in the Soviet Union did your parents come from?
Lithuania.
How about like what republic?
Lithuania.
Lithuania.
Yeah, yeah. The first to break away.
Right. Okay.
It's actually a very, like, compared to, like, of any European country, it's one of the more, like, conservative, like, if you compare American conservatism to somewhere in Europe, Lithuania almost closely matches in terms of their social and economic views. They're very, very pro-free markets. They hate communists.
I feel like
And, like,
most countries in Eastern Europe are now conservative due to the fact
Yeah.
that what they went through in the Soviet
Yeah.
Union.
Definitely. Yeah, so, and there's a lot of nature there, so that's kind of how I'm the way I am, because it's kind of in the bloodstream.
The only Eastern European nation that's not conservative is Russia.
Oh, definitely not.
Russia's like a different, Russia's like a different breed.
Very much so. Thank you all. So lovely to talk to you in person and virtually.